Hi folks, how's everybody doing? Welcome, thank you for joining us today. My name is Ana Maria Leon. I use she, her pronouns. I want to begin by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American Program, HUNAP or HUNAP, in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. Yesterday, we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, and I want to note that HUNAP's annual lecture delivered by David Troyer, Leech Lake Ojibwe, is currently posted on their website and offers an in-depth perspective on the current state of affairs for Native and Indigenous peoples in the Americas, and you can find it at hunap.harvard.edu. I know I'm promoting a different department, but I thought it was timely. A quick reminder that we have live captioning available tonight for our virtual audience, and to make that visible, click the closed captioning button at the bottom of the live stream window. I also want to invite you, now I have to promote local program, to join us for an upcoming GSD public program on Friday, October 14, and Saturday, October 15. The Harvard University Graduate School of Design, in partnership with the Arnold Arboretum, will host a two-day academic conference as part of the National Olmsted 200 celebration, and more information is available on the GSD's website. Now for tonight's event, which is the Carl M. Sapers Ethics and Practice Lecture. Carl Sapers was a Boston lawyer specialized in working with architects. He taught legal practice in design and studies in professional practice at the GSD from 1984 until his retirement in 2010. He was also involved in several public-facing activities, including the Foundation for Brookline Housing, which he founded, an organization that promoted inclusive access to housing in his own community. This focus on an ethical approach to practice is very much carried forward by our guest speaker today, Milton Curry. Milton Curry is professor of architecture at the University of Southern California School of Architecture, where he was dean and Della and Harry McDonald Dean's Chair in Architecture from 2017 to 2022. He is currently on a research leave from USC as visiting scholar at the Harvard GSD for this fall. Professor Curry holds an MArch from the GSD and a bachelor's in architecture from Cornell, and has held leadership and faculty positions at USC, University of Michigan Ann Arbor, Cornell University, and at the Harvard GSD. Professor Curry is committed to the democratic project of the American University, and believes that linking the design arts, humanities, and technology produces nonlinear creative thinking that synthesizes humanist and technical know-how in ways that produce new knowledge. He is founder of Critical Productive and has produced seminal writings and creative work that link architecture to the pressing societal issues of post-war Americas, such as race, class, urbanization, and postcolonialism. I first met Professor Curry at the University of Michigan, where among many other things, he developed and coordinated the Michigan Mellon Project on Egalitarianism in the Metropolis, a research initiative focused on urbanization in Mexico City, Detroit, and Rio de Janeiro, and which offered, through this sort of tripartite focus, a Pan-American or hemispheric approach that I really appreciate is very close to my own approach. He carried this generous approach over to USC, where as dean, he pivoted the school towards an ethos of the citizen architect that expands the architect's role in societal issues, and initiated new academic and research programs focused on city design and pre-college access. And I'm hoping he'll share some of his insights from these experiences in tonight's lecture, which is titled Citizen Architect, Paradoxes of Race in Democratic Culture. Please join me in welcoming Professor Milton Curry.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. It's great to see you here. You're really fortunate to have such a great person and faculty member here at the GSD. And thank you to Mark Lee, a USC alum, and your dean, Sarah Whiting, Paige, Kat, Matt, and all of your communications and marketing teams. They've done a great job. I'm honored to be giving this lecture in honor of Carl Sapers, and it's great to be back at the GSD. When I arrived that a couple minutes ago or half hour ago, the anxious kind of butterflies in the stomach hit me just as I walked into the lobby. So not much has changed at the GSD. For those students who are here, that will be with you when you come back here. But more seriously, I'm here to talk about a citizen architect and some other work that interests me, has interested me for some time, so I want to go ahead and get started. And I would say first, through a more robust framing of the citizen architect who is positioned as an innately democratic and egalitarian force in democratic space, the discipline of architecture, I believe, can engage in democratizing cultural production and really revitalizing subaltern thought. Race and blackness as theoretical vehicles, I think, are essential towards rethinking the democratic present in the face of really an apocalyptic and autocratic future. How does a racialized subject come to know themselves physically, socially, psychically? The American postcolonial subject is operating, of course, amongst the vexed forces of intellectual and social history, the forces of the humane horizon, somewhat unattainable ideals that we put out there of meritocracy, egalitarianism, freedom, liberty, and equality, and of course the forces of lived experience itself, living under constant threat and precarity. But in addition to laws and codified norms, democracy is organized around concepts of space and sociality that cohere polities to one another. And the discipline of architecture, I believe, has an important role to play in reclaiming our ideals, really actualizing change and transforming our society towards repair. So this evening I want to lay out two tracks really in work that's in process, so I appreciate your comments and observations. The first is focused on the idea of the citizen architect related to academia, pedagogy, identity, and diversity. And the second part is associated with the idea of what I call architecture race theory, focused on race-integrated scholarship and design interventions in our discipline, making them more coherent and part of the core, really, of how architecture theory is conceptualized. So with that, I look forward to the Q&A, and I'll start with citizen architect. Many of you probably have heard this term, and I'd heard it many times and found it to be grossly overused and under-theorized, perhaps representing our discipline's seamless alignment with the neoliberalism and corporatization that now plagues academic institutions and civic discourse. Citizen and architect, when decoupled, appear to be in tension with one another, with citizen operating in service of a concept, citizenship and nation, what Benedict Anderson termed the imagined community, and architect operating perhaps in service of a client, focused on the commercialization of professional services and or the aesthetic expression of his or her set of values emanating from the Beaux-Arts tradition. I use the term in my installation speech as dean at USC in part because I believe that our discipline needed to be on offense, narratively, intellectually, publicly, in changing our posture towards diversity, but also towards rethinking our role in developing a more coherent collective imagination. The imagination that Benedict Anderson talks about in Imagined Communities is itself the bulwark against monarchy and totalitarianism. And in both the conceptualization of citizen architect and what I'm calling architecture race theory, the aim is to use the trauma, really, of raciality to alter our imagination, derive creative purchase by taking on the project of social construction of the subject through visual and spatial interventions and initiatives. Citizenship and belonging, after all, really are at the core of the current and ongoing conversation of how we repair American democracy after the wholesale enslavement and dehumanization of our black populations, traumatization through stolen land and land rights of our indigenous and Latinx populations, and threats to democracy and our system of education that have and are now taking place in our country. In University of Michigan President James Angle's commencement address in 1879, he stated, quote, "The most democratic atmosphere in the world is that of the college. There all meet on absolutely equal terms. Nowhere else do accidents of birth or condition count for so little," end quote. Ezra Cornell stated in his address at the opening of Cornell University in 1868, quote, "I hope that we have laid the foundation of an institution which shall combine practical and liberal education, which shall fit the youth of our country for the professions, the farms, the mines, the manufactories, the investigations of science, and for mastering all the practical questions of life with success and honor," end quote. Now, these are declarations by university presidents, but they're not just merely rhetorical flourishes, they're ideological imperatives that in fact buttress the aspirational egalitarianism that we all want or should want for our educational system in the United States. But privatization, defunding, the diversion of funding of public education strikes really at the core of our social compact, as do movements to ban the teaching of race and other subjects offensive to portions of the population. So how did we get here? And I'll move through this quickly because I know I've got a Harvard audience that you'll know most of what I'm about to say. But the Civil Rights Act of 1866, we'll start there, designated race and color as the earliest forms of protected classes, barring discrimination against members of these groups on the basis of race and color. These protected classes have expanded to include additional categories of persons such as religious beliefs, age, sex, gender, disability status, and harassment. Yet the original protected classes continue to bear the brunt of overt and systemic racism. Brown versus Board of Education, a landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision, outlawed separate but equal education systems and set the stage for decades-long battles over forced busing and nationwide desegregation plans to integrate racially segregated public schools. But today, many parts of the country are more racially segregated by race and class than at any other point in our history. And many of our public school systems are more segregated by race and ethnicity than they were during the period immediately following the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Public school districts, as you know, are chronically underfunded, understaffed, and lacking in providing basic competencies, particularly for students of color. Colleges introduced affirmative action in college admissions so that students' racial and ethnic backgrounds could be part of a holistic review of their qualifications for admission. In Regents of University of California versus Bakke in 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that a university's use of racial quotas in its admissions process was unconstitutional, but a school's use of affirmative action to accept more minority applicants was constitutional in some circumstances. California voters passed Proposition 209 in 1996, and Michigan voters passed Proposition 2 in 2006, both to prohibit and ban public institutions from discriminating on the basis of race and other characteristics. More recently, in Grutter v. Bollinger in 2003 and Gratz v. Bollinger in 2003, the Supreme Court ruled that the use of affirmative action in school admissions is constitutional if it treats race as one of many factors and if the purpose is to achieve a diverse class. The court reasoned that the Michigan law school's goal of student diversity was a compelling interest and found that the law school's individual review of each applicant, where race was only one of many factors, was narrowly tailored. In Fisher v. University of Texas, 2016, and Fisher 2, a case that succeeded that, the court held that the Court of Appeals in the Fifth Circuit for the first Fisher case correctly found that the University of Texas at Austin undergraduate admissions policy survived strict scrutiny in accordance with the first Fisher case, which ruled that strict scrutiny should be applied to determine the constitutionality of the university's race-sensitive admissions after California's Proposition 209. A recent study, Affirmative Action, Mismatch, and Economic Mobility after California's Proposition 209, provided the first causal evidence that banning affirmative action exacerbates socioeconomic inequities. And the court will hear two similar lawsuits by anti-affirmative action groups, Students for Fair Admissions, in one day. They'll hear both cases on October 31st of this year, one against the University of North Carolina, and the second against Harvard University. Hopefully, we will all be proven wrong, but we expect that by this time next year, both public and private universities will probably be prohibited to take race into account in university admissions. This matters to us as architects and design professionals precisely because our investment in relevance, the relevance of our projects to drive culture, to be provocative to the subjects that we are designing for, and our desire to be at the core of the construction of modern subjectivity and subjects requires that we get off the sidelines. Now, in defining a citizen, I want to track two components of subjectivity. One you might say is being a citizen, and one might be becoming a citizen. But the right to be or become citizen also unlocks a chain of events leading to one's capacity to be able to attain rights. In longer form, I go into the Arendtian version of subjectivity and also Hegel's social theory as they relate to the ability of subjects to constitute their own freedom and their capacity to know how to use it. Let's take Hannah Arendt's right to have rights, a quote from her 1949 and 1951 versions of The Origins of Totalitarianism. Marcia Gessen, writing in The New Yorker in 2018, states, according to the United Nations, there are a record 65.6 million people who have been forcibly displaced. 22.5 million are considered refugees. 10 million people are currently stateless. The refugee crisis after World War II revealed to Hannah Arendt that humans can exist in a place called nowhere. They can be displaced from political community. They can be turned into abstractions. It is clear that not only can humans exist in a place called nowhere, but once they have lost their position in the political community, they can never be certain of regaining it. Now here, to have rights means to participate, in fact, in staging, creating, and sustaining through protest, legislation, collective action, or institution building, a common political world where the ability to legitimately claim and demand rights becomes a possibility for everyone, end quote. Now, the right to have rights is, in fact, the fight that we're currently in. The so-called right to the city, the right to housing, the right to justice, the right to a publicly funded or publicly subsidized form of education. And on the question of the status of the citizen, the refugee, the migrant, as transnational subjects, architecture and urbanism have a central role in the conception of the city as a physical, spatial, civic, social space of settlement and habitation, and I argue in the construction of the citizen as a humane subject. Conjoining the problematic of diversity in our discipline, the fight to retain access to public education, and the capacity to influence public policy, and the nature of how rights are conceptualized, I'm going to take you back to high school. Because K through 12 education is where we need to make investments of intellectual and financial resources. As of 2022, 2.8% of American architects were African American, although African Americans hold 13% of the US population. 9.9% are Latinx. Now, there are many factors in play: unique residential segregation by class and race, education gaps that appear in the K through 12 time span, lack of sufficient cultivation of successful mindsets, lack of critical mass of underrepresented minorities and other marginalized groups, making it more difficult to create a sense of well-being and belonging, and the focus on identifying talent versus cultivating potential. With Monica Ponce de Leon at University of Michigan, I developed the nation's first high school architecture program with a novel structure of having half of each day devoted to architecture for an entire semester of a student's junior year in high school. The University of Michigan Architect program started in 2015, based in Detroit, but run by the School of Architecture and Urban Planning, and continues to this day, having graduated over 300 students. I did it again, needing my head examined probably, at USC, bringing that program onto campus, working with Los Angeles Unified School District. That started in 2021, and I would say that the exposure to public school students has really been key, as well as the bonding and socialization that studio-based work supports at this particular age. But the pedagogy and the work results are as important, and I want to just walk you through some of those to get you acquainted with some of the aspects of the program that I'm very proud of. First, this is what we're dealing with. Students who have no conception of what an architect is, they have very little conception of what an architect does. Their understanding of the college admissions process can be weak to okay, and they're thinking about their future. In some cases, the questions haven't been asked. And so that's the population. And when we talk about underrepresented students, the majority of Black and Latinx students are coming from public schools. The pedagogy is important because we're training the mind to be ready for the education that exists here at USC, at Michigan, at our schools of architecture. And one of the things that we did was really embed the idea of thinking about social movements and public space in a very deep and serious way with the students, and I think the results were very intriguing. And so we start with drawing objects. We then look at a kind of activator of a kind of installation within the city, and then we look at a kind of activator in the form of a building, called it Agitprop Commons. And what we gained out of this, I think, was a very interesting kind of intersection between thinking about social movements, thinking about visual movements in art and contemporary art. This particular student was looking at Kara Walker and simply, exploring the notion of figuration and trauma through space and form, and beginning to translate that into something that they could call their own. And then moving into the form of a building, beginning to kind of see visualization as something that has important social impacts and social implications. Another student took a collage from Frida Kahlo, where she was yearning to be back in home in Mexico, and began to kind of develop a notion of melancholy, if you will, between these two geographic positions of the United States and Mexico, and translate that into the space of a building, and begin to then infill that with program that begin to kind of situate those feelings within space. And so I think those are very important because that's the future. And I think those programs, which other schools can do, and there are other ways to be involved, summer programs, but I think this is really, really critical. That's what I want to really emphasize, that it's not something that is extra to the role of universities. So, in moving to the second part of the talk on architecture race theory, I want to start with a quote from Mark Bradford. Artist Mark Bradford says, "I want to engage a social, political conversation about the contemporary world that I live in or my relationship to it, and at the same time I want to abstract it." And I think when we think about modernity and progress, in terms of architecture, technology, science, social relations, and the humanities, we often think about it in terms of abstraction, about the reduction and expansion of complexity in order to transmit information, in order to make it accessible and legible. As an abstract individual or a homogeneous collective, the social ideals and aspirations of European modernists were far from singular, but nevertheless consistent in declaring progressive aims while advancing postcolonial controls and capitalist imaginings. Architecture theory coheres in the late 1960s precisely to evade the constraints of conventional historiography, reception theory, in a way the provincialism of art historical-like discourses on aesthetics, unwittingly and maybe paradoxically in favor of potential progressive moves towards inclusion. Yet, from the period of what I call peak theory or peak cultural theory in the late 1980s to the late 1990s, when area studies, postcolonial theory, feminist theory, deconstructivist and deconstructionist theory were at their height, architecture theorists, for the most part, severed race and blackness from the conversation, effectively doubling down on the fraught universal subject generated as a part of the European project of modernism and modernity. The primacy and focus on form, tectonics, and language instead of bodies, subjects, and identities precluded architecture theory from realizing true intellectual breakthroughs achieved by other disciplines that foregrounded subjectivities as something innately related to social construction and social power. When in fact, race and blackness, cosmopolitanism and black diaspora, cultural and social solidarity, and the self-awareness of the construction of whiteness are part and parcel of the American project and simply have to be a central feature of post-war architecture theory, yet they were not. The disavowal of those who resisted the inclusion of these features of the theoretical landscape, I think, have to be accounted for, corrected for, and historicized and reckoned with appropriately. And I do this in a longer version of this talk to be able to understand what happened. We need an autopsy of that period in order to be able to recover some of the energy that was lost, and thinking just in terms of something like the subaltern, which is something that just one example of something that we need to recover in a way. Without those antecedents, without that inclusion, black architecture theorists and others have had to create a new field to articulate their standpoint epistemology. Their unique vantage point is self-aware, racialized subjects. In longer format, I strategically analyze and celebrate some of the works by interdisciplinary scholars such as Paul Gilroy, Kim Crenshaw, Tom Sugrue, Madhu Dubé, Catherine Yurka, Tommy Shelby, Darby English, Elizabeth Hinton, many who have been working actively in this space. And also in architecture and urbanism, of the work of Darrell Fields, Mabel Wilson, Charles Davis, Mario Gooden, Amanda Williams, Hansi Barraza, Luis Carranza, Ana Maria Leon, Patricio Del Real, Walter Hood, Olaquan Jayafus, Paul Williams. This work is really important to think about. I participated in the construction of this subfield with essays in the 1990s, the founding of Appendix, which I founded while I was a student here at the GSD, with Darrell Fields and Kevin Fuller, co-editors, co-founders. And I also founded Critical Productive, which launched in 2012 with a couple of pilot issues, and will relaunch next year with a call for projects going out very soon with MIT Press as distributor, which is very exciting. But at this point, the coherence of this subfield is diverse, with some in this constellation arguing for the inclusion of cultural practices such as jazz, music, and hip-hop as generators of cultural form, architectural form, while others trace the classical orders to racial ideologies that inform form-making, while others deride modernism as such, as antithetical to abolitionist democracy vis-a-vis Du Bois and other scholars. My attempt here in this work, in architecture race theory, is to make these different theoretical positions coherent within a larger whole, and thereby allow for more recognition of this scholarship in creative work, but also to prepare the ground for much-needed debate. Your GSD students and faculty, so conversation is great, debate's even better, right? And so in a recent essay that I wrote for the Museum of Modern Art catalog for the exhibition Reconstruction, Architecture and Blackness in America, I outlined this notion of toward an architecture race theory, and I want to read that as a predicate to the next part of this talk. Architecture race theory is a new terminology and conceptual frame for a discursive movement that really has already begun. It defines a constellation of scholarship and creative work at the forefront of decentering dominant and hegemonic gazes through which modernist and postmodernist theories of architecture have emerged. It defines projective scholarship and creative work that set forth imaginaries of space and form that reposition Black and African diasporic identities as worthy of inclusion within a new mainstream of architectural discourse. It's a conceptual frame that unabashedly embraces a political leftist agenda to radically transform institutions and fundamental conceptions of power within the discipline and practice of architecture. Architecture race theory insists upon a critical approach to the methodologies of teaching and practicing architecture, inviting more narrative-based methods of ascertaining the projective impacts of our creative work on actual human subjects, and demanding disciplinary reliance upon more race-conscious sociological data and information to inform urban scale and architectural decisions. The core tenets of architecture race theory are, one, to use critical theory as a reparative intellectual method for making race visible in canonical American and European architectural discourses. Second is to use critiques of neoliberalism and capitalism to analyze the role of race in producing inequity. Third is to use the creative and analytical tools of architecture thinking to design to reintroduce a race-integrated imagination. And fourth, to instrumentalize the exceptional global narrative of Black and African diaspora as fundamental to the evolution of egalitarianism as an ideological concept and core to the democratic ideal. And I go through more detail in this project, but I want to highlight some features that that kind of bubble up to the surface that I think can be readily accessible for conversation. First is, why undertake this project and what are the stakes? I was not satisfied with the way in which pedagogy at the elite institutions I attended sublimated questions of identity, subjectivity, and race through the projection of the modernist canon of architectural works, but also through the presentation of theoretical claims and diagrams that imbricated into our consciousness ways to interpret architecture. I'm thinking of Jacques Lacan's diagram of the gaze here. I'm also thinking of Rosalind Krauss's influential diagram and book and essay, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. Why were questions of land ownership, empire, and the nature of monuments and monumentality not brought into the conversation? In psychoanalysis and race scholarship, Lacan's diagram and thinking prompted work on objectification, gender, and subjectivity. But architecture theory sublimated these questions, particularly around race and visibility. Similarly, the canonical works of Schinkel and Le Corbusier and Koolhaas and Eisenman, have we subjected this work to discourse on how architectural language is received by people of different identities and take a race-integrated approach to that reception? I didn't know about the work of Du Bois in these amazing data graphics that begin to think about the sociological work of thinking through Reconstruction, thinking through what it means to be Black in America. I wasn't taught about the protests that happened in Mexico City in 1968, staged at Plaza de Tres Culturas with Mario Pani's expansive Tlatelolco, Nanayaloco modernist project as a backdrop. Or for that matter, the scenographics of the Haitian Revolution or the work of Paul Williams. The work of Black modernists like Paul Williams were conveniently left out of canonization, probably because they were deemed not pure enough as modernists to be included, even though we know Le Corbusier in Europe and Villanueva in Venezuela, to take just two examples, did a ton of classical influence work early in their career, but that didn't keep them out of the canon. The work of Paul Williams, which I acquired as Dean of USC with the Getty, and we're working through the archives, is really an amazing corpus of a modernist working and struggling with all typologies of building, including public housing. A lot of people don't realize that Paul Williams did a fair amount of public housing in addition to other projects, including houses for Frank Sinatra and many others. But we're working through how we survey, how we display this in exhibition format to the public, and how we basically kind of present this modernist who's very complex and eclectic. Likewise, there's the historiography informed by theory that is and needs to take place. Historians are taking this on, and I applaud them. It's also the presentist moment of theorizing the intersectional work across architecture, urbanism, landscape, and contemporary art. Here, too, we find our mainstream critics at a sudden loss for words as we try to interpret and provide critical analysis. For example, the National Museum of African American History and Culture by Ajay Bond Freelon, the Legacy Museum by Bass, the new International Museum of African American History by Henry Cobb and Walter Hood. We want to celebrate these spaces, of course, but what are they saying about cultural memory, didactic aesthetics, and the role of racial imaginary, and letting that play out, pictorializing scenes of trauma, or perhaps even Disneyfication of certain kinds of racial histories, as if one is a tourist in a way. We can't be afraid to have a critical arsenal that really engages this work, because that's what gives it actually more credibility, and I believe we're not doing that enough. Likewise, how do we read and interpret the spatiality of visual art, such as Kerry James Marshall's work, Mark Bradford, Glenn Ligon, Kara Walker, Lauren Halsey, and Virgil Abloh. So a part of this project is how do we put forth theories that historians and designers can use to better interpret these histories, these canons, in corrective ways, and how to interpret new works that have emerged, and argue that critiques of neoliberalism and capitalism, having a race-integrated imagination, keeping attuned to movements of the Black diaspora, these can take us on different intellectual journeys and deliver refreshed pedagogical interventions that disrupt some of our own conventional thinking when it comes to this work. One central feature of the project as well is how to reconcile the work that architects and designers do in determining who they are designing for, both in the present and the future. What are the characteristics of identity that are extant? What aspects are residual from historical periods? And what kind of porosity is available to us as we provocate or provoke or induce subjective formation as we're producing these cultural subjects? We started this conversation by discussing the notion of citizen and the importance of that through a reading of Arendt, of understanding subject position. Even before we address it, we address the subject as having a legitimate positionality to even be a citizen. There we have access to work on the right to have rights, but there are other instances in Western philosophy, vexed examples of barriers that are placed onto colonial subjects in particular that make it difficult for them to reconstitute themselves as truly postcolonial subjects. Let's take the example of Hegel and the contemporary work to undo one of his theoretics around subjectivity. Hegel's conservative notions place the individual's value to society and society's hands in Hegel's social theory, a major text, while contemporary philosophers Miranda Fricker and Christy Dotson radicalize the notion of social power and knowledge production. Hegel's incomplete individual, who is made whole by society's affirmation of his or her identity, actually that's demoralizing for colonized, marginal subjects. Hegel states, and I quote, "Since unformed subjects lack even the aspiration to be free, they lack both the knowledge of their true essence and the desire to achieve it. It is intrinsic to the nature of education and forming their maturity that this take place unconsciously and involuntarily, behind their back, so to speak, of the very subjects who undergo the process of formation," end quote. And what Hegel leaves out of this formation is the invisible power dynamic that marginalizes the individual as a primitive subject, unable to operate cognitively with independence. Miranda Fricker's notion of epistemic injustice is that power constructs social relations in ways that lower the credibility of marginal subjects and relegates their social identity as prejudicially lower in stature than the powerful higher class subject. She says, quote, "The basic idea is that a speaker suffers a testimonial injustice if prejudice on the hearer's part causes him to give the speaker less credibility than he would otherwise be given, as in the case where the police simply don't believe someone because they're black," end quote. Christy Dodson's work on epistemic oppression, which she articulates the unequal participation in the activities that actually shape the categories through which we understand the world, makes some people's lives less intelligible, sometimes less intelligible to themselves and often less intelligible to others. This is similarly innovative in dismantling certain groups' singular claim to be knowledge producers and adjudicators. She states, quote, reducible epistemic oppression, which follows from features of epistemological systems, can only begin to be addressed through recognition of the limits of one's overall epistemological frameworks, end quote. Now, Dodson and Fricker pose fundamental questions that reveal how social power is fraught within inherent prejudice to ignore, marginalize, and subordinate inferior human subjects. Hegel's construct of the free subject requires that the subject subjugate themselves to the desires of a powerful other who must affirm their desires for him or her. And therefore, alternate sites and products of black and white cultural production have to be marshaled to buttress new conceptions of space and visuality that is critically inclusive of blackness itself as a theoretic. The conception rests upon what I call protocols of the imaginary that catalyze in the formation evolution of blackness how it maps itself through the course of the politicized social field, the paradoxical aesthetic domain of modernism, and the expansive economic and legal space of the post-industrial city. With the whitened suburb and the blackened inner city in place, with their differentiated architecture serving as a visual index of race, modern American literature, film, and protest movement visual work offers a unique aesthetic of resistance to mainstream presentations of the problem of race. For example, in discussing American literature and the production of whiteness, engaging theorists like Catherine Yorka, Walter Ben Michaels, and Madhu Dubé illustrate how literary aesthetic tropes inflected white subjectivity and its approach to racialized space in both the city and suburb. In fact, in the 1920s, American literature was doing two things, effectively translating raciality into a consciousness that inverted racism's alliance with feudal slave economy into an imaginary consciousness that no longer needed the materiality of a plantation. In American literature, the disinterestedness in colonizing Africa on the part of the white subject in Tarzan, or what Edward Said calls the colonial actuality existing at the heart of metropolitan life, exposed what Catherine Yorka calls a possessive individualism, sentimental dispossession, leading to an emotional investment in property and a feeling of impoverishment through prosperity. The possessive individualism and sentimental dispossession of the white suburbanites of the early 1900s and the racially mixed suburbanites of the current day continue to erode any notion of social justice in the face of abstractly racialized legal and spatial ideologies embedded into the core of our country's governing logic. As Yerker writes in White Diaspora, quote, when suburban characters in early white American fiction on suburbia articulate their freedom, it is because they perceive that freedom to come under assault. When that freedom seems assured, it is evacuated in favor of emotional and spiritual dispossession, end quote. In contemporary films, you can see this in House of Sand and Fog, Revolutionary Road, Ice Storm, Disturbia, and even American Beauty, where one sees a continuous obsession with the suburb as a site of exclusive white subjectivity and class domination. So I argue in this section that the urban, in fact, is a domain of recognition for the black subject, a counter to Hegel's requirement that the modernist subject, in fact, meet the social, in fact, placing him or herself in a state of becoming only through mutual recognition in the public sphere. This is precisely the domain of thought that catalyzes Fricker and Dodson to chart a different path to full subjectivity through conceptions of epistemic oppression and epistemic injustice. But this is not even enough for this conceptualization. In moving to understand and appreciate the unique aspects of black diasporic cultural production and black solidarity in the context of world-making, we need to understand how the civil rights movement and how the historical narratives of our indigenous populations as well, play a central role in the construction of the nation, have played a central role in the construction of the nation. As in the case of the United States, it's imperial power globally, and as we know from recent work by Jason Stanley and others, the American version of racism and Jim Crow laws provided, in fact, the basis for European fascism that is back at the forefront. In the 1920s to the present, the so-called modern age of black nationalism, including the invention of the Black Power movement, this emerged simultaneous with the modern American literature that was shaping racial attitudes towards urban and suburban space. And I won't go into much detail, but the different brands of black nationalism, which gets us to conceptions of black solidarity, particularly by Tommy Shelby, are looking at how to define a kind of pragmatic black nationalism, not in the form of a kind of strategic black essentialism, and in fact having what Shelby calls a thin conception of blackness, acknowledging the limitations of race as a fixed marker, and opening up spaces where I believe architecture and the processes of urbanization can be seen to play a catalytic role in constructing racial and national subjectivity. I want to walk through some examples of how I think we have optimistic work that is conceptualizing this terrain of thought, but we need more of it. And just to recap a bit, in these now 3 examples of Arendt's notion of the right to have rights, the critique of Hegelian notions of social theory, and the understanding of what might constitute a black solidarity, a black nationalism, architecture race theory as a subfield, as I've described, begins to define a coherent logic to access both the construction of identity historically and in the present, as well as harness the creativity to produce, in fact, new forms of knowledge by centering black and underrepresented thinking and voices, decentering the primacy of whiteness as a theoretic, and repositioning certain kinds of cultural considerations towards political progress. Some will take this in a direction of abolitionist thinking, while others will chart a course that adheres to more centrist notions of integration and inclusion. Skip that. In the 2004, I was part of a show at Harlem World called Harlem World Metropolis's Metaphor, curated by Thelma Golden at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And I was fortunate to be asked to write an essay and be on the advisory board of Reconstruction's Architecture and Blackness in America that opened at MoMA in 2020. And part of what I tried to do in my project at Harlem World was to begin to think about the perversity of how we were constructing urban space and the reliance on capital, private capital, to do public good. And so in a series of collages and thinking visually, I was working with thinking about what it would mean to have a Target occupy a super block in Harlem, and to think about that as a developer of needed housing, other services. And so I constructed this kind of project that had various volumes on a kind of plinth, but had these also very poetic moments of both a provocative kind of polemical projection at the urban scale, but then more sinuous and kind of provocative moments around community engagement and thinking about subjectivity in a very deep way of that community. I was working very much in contradistinction to the work that was produced in MoMA's exhibition in 1968, Architecture and Urban Renewal, with 5 teams from all the Ivy League schools, no black or persons of color on those teams, and I was trying to think about a kind of counter-narrative to that. And a project in my own firm looking at an opportunity that became available to think about the 100-plus acres near the Oakland Coliseum and Arena to reconstitute a kind of ground of citizenry, of citizenship, within a kind of meshwork of of intersectional programming that would leverage entertainment for community benefit. And so very much thinking about the notion of ground as a kind of arbiter of spatial ownership and sovereignty in the face of the kind of capitalization of these sports teams of which there's enormous resources poured into facilities. In reconstructions, I think there's really brilliant work that you've seen in lectures that have been given by the Black Reconstruction Collective, and I think Amanda Williams's work, and We Are Not There or Here, and I think Emmanuel Admasu's work and others really puts a fine point on this notion of how important speculative dimension of agency amongst Black architects and others working today is for us to begin to rethink pedagogy and to think creatively about where we take our discipline in the face of the challenges that we have. And so this is enormously optimistic, I think, for us. I want to close by thinking also about cities and at the urban scale, where some of this work from these exhibitions is also focused, and to think about or reflect on some of the things that we've seen in cities and some of the ways in which we've seen our political leadership weigh into this area. President Nixon, I'll take you back a ways, articulated a policy of urban renewal in speeches in 1960, 69, 73, bracketing his excursion to China in 72. But in 1960, he gave a speech at Forest Hills in which he lamented the massive redistribution of purchasing power through the transfer of wealth to the suburbs. He described the difficulty of city housing and the need for holistic policies to address large urban-scale development. He emphasized the metropolitan region as the focus of innovative solutions. But as Elizabeth Hinton indicates in her book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, under Richard Nixon and his successors, welfare programs fell by the wayside while investment in policing and punishment expanded. Anticipating future crime, policymakers urged states to build new prisons and introduce law enforcement measures into urban schools and housing, turning neighborhoods into targets of police surveillance. In the 1980s, Bill Clinton, under Bill Clinton's leadership, in an article that I wrote many years ago and that will be included in a way in this work, Bill Clinton and HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros did a flip-flop. Initially, early in their administration, Cisneros signaled a willingness to look at mass rehabilitation of the government's public housing stock, only to reverse course and sign on to the New Urbanist, Congress of New Urbanist agenda and mandate the teardown of urban public housing and the transformation of those properties to multifamily, New Urbanist-style complexes, resulting in massive displacement, gentrification that we've seen, unfortunately. I witnessed in Detroit a fraudulent bankruptcy produced by Governor Rick Snyder and emergency manager Kevin Orr, resulting in a bailout for banks and virtually nothing for Detroit residents. The draining of the city's coffers through years of strategic disinvestment and diversion, a winnowing down and privatization of basic city services, and the rampant giveaway of public monies to developers has resulted in redevelopment of downtown Detroit for a wealth class and little improvement in Detroit's outlying neighborhoods. This has been chronicled in Scott Kuroshige's book and Jason Stanley's essay on Detroit and Michelle Wild Anderson's work on minimal cities, how cities are drained of public resources and then they've got to go out and hunt for private resources to survive. So in conclusion, these two
projects, which I hope seem to have some relation to each other, but are different projects, represent within the citizen architect formulation an imperative for architecture, academia and practice, and universities to deliver on the promise of education access, with architecture thinking as an intersectional component for spatial literacy and a refreshed egalitarian approach to the city and issues of basic rights. We can take a leadership position in getting in the game on preparing K through 12 students to become citizen architects. With architecture race theory, extending and deepening work already underway and expanding our notions of what is part of the canon, problematizing the vexed history of architecture theory, discourse over the last 35 years, and utilizing this moment of heightened racial consciousness to open up our discipline to a period of both radical diversity and transformative creativity in addressing current and future issues. Thank you.
Milton, thank you so much for that just wonderful overview of your thoughts and sort of a powerful collection of thoughts that really just broach from your time here at the GSD up until the last conversations of the last few years. I felt that these sort of two themes of the citizen architect and architecture racial theory sort of overlapped and crossed paths with those first images of the campus. These are two spaces, one a campus in Venezuela, in Caracas, and the other the Plaza of the Three Cultures, but populated by the students of UNAM, as my students will learn in a few weeks. It seemed to me that while thinking of the formation of the citizen architect, you're also thinking about the space of the campus as another imagined community where the conversations of ART, the other CRT, can take place. Is this sort of shaping of that community that you envision taking place in communities and campuses such as USC and here at the GSD? Is that, can you just take us through how you see that conversation shaping a new citizen architect through the university campus?
Sure. Well, thank you for sitting through this, by the way. The experiences I've had in being in Latin America, specifically at the campus at UNAM in Mexico City, and also in Venezuela on Villanueva's campus, in distinction to being on Harvard's campus or being at USC's campus or even University of Michigan, it's a very different feel. It feels like you're part of a public space. When you're moving through some of those campuses, and obviously those are federal universities as well. And I think that's influenced in some way my understanding of what the possibilities are for us here in the U.S. That's just a kind of personal piece of it. But I think, I do think that we need to expand the footprint of our campuses, but not in an imperialist way. And so in Michigan, with the high school program, we went to Detroit. It was very important for us to go to Detroit because that's where the need was to do a space in Detroit, 45 minutes from Ann Arbor, to service and do something that would help indigenous Detroiters. At USC, I renovated a space and we brought the program onto campus. So we actually have high school students on our campus in our facilities. We take full responsibility. They're with us a half day, for one semester of their junior year. So I think that's important credibility. It drives credibility
because with both school districts, Detroit and Los Angeles, we have credibility in terms of working with authentically these students. I think in terms of other aspects which might be, more germane to other areas such as community engagement. I think that's a big one because I think typically, and I know you have the umbrella here of the GSD, you have urban planning, urban design, and others, and we have landscape architecture at USC. But I think how we conceptualize community engagement is also something that we feel that it's very authentic, but the way it feels, again, when we understand the identities, it feels very imperialistic because we're coming with certain kinds of expectations. And so I think I think the key is these things that we take for granted as conventions need to be theorized. And I think we can be involved in thinking through what does community engagement mean. It doesn't necessarily have to mean what the planners say that it means, even though I want purchase on what they think today that in the most progressive way that could be, but also I want designers and scholars involved in that.
It may be also by forgetting that university campus in Spanish is ciudad universitaria, it's university city. It comes natural to me, but I am used to thinking about the university also as an urban space. That's slightly different, I think, in Latin America than the U.S. Campus format. You come at this moment when I'm teaching, as I was sharing with you before the lecture, the history lecture, and I'm no longer teaching Lacan or Krauss, but I'm starting with sort of a modified Marxist take on the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, read through W.B. Du Bois, the planter, and the black worker. So I hope my students made that connection, but I think we are agreed in sort of a new avenues for theorization that we are indebted to, particularly coming from sort of spatial modes of thinking that come with architecture. As perhaps looking now at the audience and looking for, there's a question, maybe a question here. I'm gonna read it. It says, maybe someone you know, because there's a familiar last name. Amazing presentation, so interesting and exciting to hear the concept of citizen architect. Can you comment on how early education might be positively impacted by a redesign of schools located in underinvested communities? Excellent talk. This is from Venice Curry.
Again, I think the same pressures. What I'm, you may not have thought that you're, going to come and hear somebody discuss K through 12 education at a lecture at Harvard, but I think that the two are more connected than you might think. And so I remember being on a call with deans, a conversation, and we were maybe a year ago. I was asked to moderate a call that the Center for Architecture, a meeting Center for Architecture does with deans of East Coast schools with a dean who's not on the East Coast. And in that conversation, I brought up the threats of CRT, critical race theory, being banned in K through 12, and said they're coming for us. They're coming for universities, and they're coming for each school and department in the university. And so I think to a certain part of the population, the dissolution of public education is part and parcel of dissolving, the critical, challenging, provocative work that goes on in universities. We can sit here and believe that as an elitist institution, we're going to be above it all, and we're just going to, have our board of trustees create a moat around our universities. But if you've looked at the news lately, and if you understand what's going on, we're under threat. And so I think that it's also a time then to think about K through 12 public education and the universities as one part of a constellation that's connected and integrated, even though we know the vast, there's vast differences between public and private education. But again, I think where we look at, the loan relief that the president signed into law for college students, we can also begin to think quite provocatively about even potentially in a post-Bakke affirmative action world, that we cap the number of students coming to Harvard and Yale and USC and other institutions from private institutions. And we allow a flood of public school persons to come in. So these are the kinds of things I think we're going to need to think much more creatively about. And they involve public education more than we have been thinking about it, sitting in our elite modes here and doing our work, but still siloed from that discourse.
I'm looking now at the audience and scanning for perhaps some raised hands. Yes, one here.
Hi, really appreciated the lecture. I thought it was incredibly dense and interesting, and I think there's a lot to unpack with it. But I was interested in the sort of the first half of the Citizen Architect and this idea of sort of the educational shifts happening in both K through 12 and university systems. In my undergrad, I went to Rice for architecture, and during sort of the Black Lives Matter protests and sort of this shift in the ways that people were thinking about educational models in the university systems, as an alumni at the time, we were pushing for the schools to shift sort of the methodologies of teaching, right, from a non engaged perspective, right, as an alumni, right. We really had not much to stand on, right, in that conversation, but somehow they managed to take some of our advice. However, looking at it a few years later, there's not much in terms of quantitative data to show that they've really done much. And this isn't just to throw them under the bus or anything, but in one of our conversations with the dean at the time, we were chatting about the actual investment of people who are actually applying to the schools, and they were saying, hey, we're really excited. This year we had 6 black applicants to our program, 6, and we had to question at that time, like, how is that even possible that you only have 6? And so what I'm wondering is, on some level, right, there's an educational push of getting people in these schools to actually be interested and excited, but also from the academic perspective, how do we get these schools to actually advocate directly and to engage? Because one of the things that they kept saying was, we're doing the best we can, right? What are our avenues? We've reached out to so many people, and I just think, what are some actual practical ways that perhaps, as people who are not engaged in this from an actual administrative point of view, right, simply as somebody who's an alumni at this school, or here right now as a student at Harvard, how can we begin to engage and push and advocate for this sort of greater community engagement? Thank you.
Thank you. As with anything, I mean, there's layered responses and accountabilities. I think, from my experience, alumni can be very important in, the messaging and the consistency of extending the values of the university and the school to the larger community, including potential students. I think as leaders, we have to demand accountability whether it's from admissions officers or recruitment or communications and marketing persons, to, in this environment, in this structure, to first expand the pool, radically expand the pool. And I think that means exposure, throughout the kind of concentric circle of the low-hanging fruit is people that are already exposed to architecture. The diagram that I showed includes people who have no clue what an architect does. But there's a whole constellation of that. And so I think there's concentric circles of where you go out and what kind of messaging, what kind of interventions are needed to expand those concentric circles. And I think that's why, for me, we landed with Monica initially, and then there's also another program at Princeton that she started as dean at Princeton. But I think we landed on, based on what we've seen, after school is not that effective. One-day programs, not that effective. They are effective, I think, in initial exposure, so in the early grades. But I think as you get into 9, 10, 11, 12, you really need something more substantive. But I do think that, getting back to your question, I mean, we were able, and this, I don't want to turn this into a commercial for USC, but we were able to significantly expand the diversity of our undergraduate student body, with the university assisting and being on board with a university-wide commitment to first-generation Pell eligible and students of color. And so we were able to 15% of our freshman class the last 2 years are Black American. That's seated, not accepted, but seated. And with Latin America, it's over 20%, Pell eligible over 20%, first generation over 20%. We did it through messaging, relentless marketing, and trying to go where the students are, meet the students where they are, whether it's through Zoom or whether it's through other means. But those are fragile. It could be 15% this year and then 2% next year if you take your foot off the gas. So I think that all of us together and collectively could probably do more than individual schools. And I know there's some collaboration, but there could be more. So that's a short answer to a very complicated issue that I do think we have found ways to be effective there. But I think we need scale and we need to work faster.
Hi, thank you. So I kind of a leader question to this. So within the field of landscape architecture, there's the Landscape Architecture Foundation, which is kind of a larger network that is also thinking in this vein and organizing K through 12 education around landscape architecture, kind of organizing universities and others. And then also they have like a secondary component for graduates. So it's like kind of incorporating and organizing mentorship and other things for people who are kind of to continue on and to maintain them within the field of landscape architecture even after. So it's like through the entire kind of life cycle. And I'm wondering within the field of architecture if these kinds of networks or these like organizational systems exist to kind of organize just beyond the universities, like the university level, like what is happening within practice and how are they supporting people of color within the field and maintaining talent within the field. So it's like, yes, you kind of get people in through K through 12, you get people in through the education system, but then maybe they lose their mentorship network as they graduate out. So kind of how do you sustain that throughout a life cycle and who's doing that, I guess?
Oh, great question. I think you're a student?
I'm a graduate.
You're a graduate. So again, graduates, alumni, and students can be incredibly influential in all of that. I think, it's varied. I mean, the National Organization of Minority Architects is doing work, the foundation you mentioned. There's, other entities, the AIA, the AIAS. So I think there's corporate resources and corporate firms and other firms that are doing work in this space. So I think all of that is effective at some level. I think when we get to how are we seeing people advance from, for example, faculty, it's great that we have diverse students, but, is that going to translate into a cycle of where we have more diverse faculty? And then, yes, we have more, some more diversity coming out of these schools, but are we going to get more partners at these firms? So I think it ultimately oscillates around power. And I think one of the things that I advocate really is mentorship by the people who look like the people that are being mentored. And so I think having diverse coalitions is great, but I also fear when we have a homogenous group trying to mentor, people who are not homogenous relative to the dominant personage. So I think that's important as well. And I think, again, staying attuned to that as these things are developing, as programs are being put in place, I think is as important as the programs themselves.
Can I pitch in with a couple of examples? I'm not sponsoring that. There's a group of schools, I'm not sure right now which ones. It includes the GSD, Michigan, and a few others who have a Dean's Initiative. Thaisa Way has been sort of coordinating it, but it has a yearly group of fellows and folks that I have been recruited in the past to participate in conversations and mentorship. There's also, I'm a big fan, supporter, and occasional contributor to DMU, Dark Matter University, which has an internal mentorship program. And I'm a huge fan of Esther Choi, who runs Office Hours, which is sort of semi-monthly. I think right now she's in hiatus because this is a one-woman enterprise, but she organizes more or less once a month Zoom conversations from people of color to people of color to mentor in sort of specific topics. And she has also recruited me on occasion at one point, but these are just, amazing examples that, sometimes a small effort can do a lot. But I just want to say also, students have a lot of power, but universities, perhaps let's not film this part, universities don't want you to know that. But you do have a lot of power, and you have already created a lot of change. So you should know that. It comes from a bad place, right? I'm going to shut up in a moment, because it comes from the neoliberal university that, treats students like clients, but it does provide them a lot of power. Here's a question right here.
That's true, actually. GSD students have changed the culture of the school since you've been here, Milton, since I was here as a little fellow. Extraordinary power. I think there's great connection between your two topics, but I do think the missing piece is practice. So I'm going to try to frame it up two kind of questions from that. So one is, in 2015, when I was running the JMX Bond Center, we did a study on inclusion in architecture, and we looked at our, Black and Latin practitioners. We did a survey to try to understand who knew about architecture, what it meant. We interviewed teachers, counselors, parents, as well as youth. And so part of the challenge is the people who are mentoring youth don't know what architects do, so therefore that translation gap is missing. We inventoried faculty, and then practitioners as well. And so one of the things that we also learned, some of the questions were very similar to yours, but the barriers to entry to education vis-a-vis cost, but also the value proposition of coming out of school as an architect, starting wages, the fee requirements for licensure, so beginning to stack up the cost of being an architect was another kind of deterrent. So on the one hand, how do we think about that? But then connecting it to architecture race theory, one of the things that I'm sort of seeing in that, and as I'm seeing in some students' work here, is leaning into that theory and challenging how it changes not only the way in which they produce an architecture and an architectural language, but how does it push on changing the very definition of what an architect is, right? And are we too singular in our notions of what a practicing architect is? And in fact, when we were naming some of the folks in Reconstruction, I'll just pick Amanda Williams, for example. She no longer calls herself an architect and doesn't want to be called an architect. And so she's, as an artist, interrogating architecture in a certain way and perhaps making an influence in the built environment. So I wonder if the middle piece of your two-part work begins to interrogate whether or not who we call an architect or what an architect is also needs to be reframed if we actually are to practice in this architectural race theory and see the outputs of what that theory holds.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation and challenge. I think, Virgil Abloh is another. Lauren Halsey was trained as an architect for a couple of years. Yeah. So I think that the practice of architecture is also under constraints, and as dean, one of the pleasures, I guess, is being able to meet and talk with people who run firms, small, boutique, large, corporate, all of them, and getting a scan of what's happening at the same time. And it's quite remarkable. It can be a very wide constellation. At certain moments, they align, everything's going well. At other moments, it's all very different. The other thing that's happening in the margins can be very small. The other thing that's happening is Black-owned and minority-owned firms are being acquired and or choosing to merge with larger firms. So that creates a situation where large firms take the acquired smaller minority firm and participants and go pitch for work that used to be more accessible to those firms on a more, I don't want to say exclusive basis, but they had more possibilities there. Given the construct of our field, I think any sane person coming into architecture school has to be open to a wider array of professional possibilities. And when I was in Michigan and running the high school program, we would get students saying, well, I want to be an engineer, or I want to be an interior designer. And we just said, we just got to say architecture is the gateway to every design profession. And I know my use of architecture even at USC, because it's the USC School of Architecture, not the USC School of Design, that's taken to mean not including landscape architecture, not including heritage conservation, that type of thing, but I actually view it differently. So I think, number one, selling architecture as the gateway to a larger constellation of real estate development, community engagement, politics. When you think about business school and law school, does anybody, I guess some people do go to Harvard Law School or Harvard Business School to be on the Supreme Court or to be head of IBM, but many go for the thinking to then take into whatever area they want to go into. And I think, the heft of a place like Harvard, because of the scale, and the heft of a USC because of the scale, situated within Research One, Michigan, I think these institutions can take on much more presence in terms of actually, putting that front and center, that this is a place of larger constellations. And obviously you have real estate here. Cornell just picked up real estate. So there's a number of things I think can be done in that space. But I think selling architecture as a gateway to itself and other things is probably more effective. On the financial front, I think, I'll say this publicly, I don't think practice has put its money where its mouth is. And when I look at the large firms the amount of billings and the profitability. These firms, some of them are very profitable. I don't think they're putting enough investment into the problems that some of which I outlined today in the K through 12 space. As I said, we need scale and we need to work faster. And the resources can help us do that. But I think we need a lot more investment, not exclusively from practice, but I think a lot more, we should expect a lot more from practice.
Thank you so much, Milton. With that, I think we are over time. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us, and help me in thanking Milton.